Hello, I'm Christopher Herring, and I'd like to welcome you today to a webinar that is going to benefit you and your private business. Perhaps it's going to bless you as a person who's looking at, what companies are hot and what aren't, just simply from the standpoint of trends. I have a very good friend, a person who helped us launch Global Chamber San Antonio, Peter Grabiec, who is going to talk to you today about this sustaining of our U.S. trade during the COVID-19. We've seen so many different shifts in our marketplace. Peter actually joined the UTSA, University of Texas San Antonio, SBDC, International Trade Center, in 2017 as a senior international business advisor. He's currently been promoted into his new role as a project manager for the UTSA MBDA Export Center, which also falls under the U.S. Department of Commerce. Peter has spent the prior 15 years of his life living and working abroad on 5 different continents. He's worked with private companies, non-governmental and intergovernmental organizations, as well as academic institutions. Peter's work has focused in the areas of sustainable economic development, good governance, organizational development, international finance, entrepreneurship, which is my heart, education, and trade. Peter holds a bachelor's degree in economics, philosophy, and political science, and has a master's degree in government and politics with a focus in international law and diplomacy. He also has his MBA with concentration in international business. And so today we really have someone who I've always wanted to put out in front of our global chamber tribe, because I know that he's going to give you some information today that's simply going to enable you to think differently, maybe differently in terms of how you're looking at the business place, maybe differently in terms of how you're looking at city planning or your town. I know today we have some great people on the line. I'd like to thank Latifah Jackson with Edwards Aquifer, who is a sponsor to our global chamber events in San Antonio. So thank you, Latifah, for being on today and being a part of our board. And also we have Mayor Hill Murphy from Garland, North Carolina, who is excited about taking part in this webinar. So with that being said, Peter, are you ready to share with this audience what you shared to our board, I think a couple of months ago?
I am, Chris, and thank you for that introduction.
All right. Well, I'm going to let you go ahead and start with the presentation. And thank you so much for preparing this for today.
Thank you.
And we're going to do questions and answers following your presentation.
Okay.
I do have some questions that we've already seen because of the presentation that we've shared, and I'm looking forward to asking you those questions.
Excellent. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. First, I want to thank everyone for their time. Thank you, Chris, again for that introduction. I do know that as everything, not everything, but a considerable amount of our activity is moving to the online space, our time has become that much more constrained and valuable. So I'll try to get through this presentation relatively quickly in order to leave some time for discussion. So can everybody see the presentation slides here?
Sure can.
Okay, so my name is Peter Grabiec, and I am a export project manager at the Minority Business Development Agency Export Center. We are housed at the Institute for Economic Development at the University of Texas at San Antonio, and we are housed at their downtown campus. I just want to give kind of a quick overview of the presentation itinerary, and I should probably run this as a slideshow. Bear with me just one moment. That might be a better visual. Okay, I don't know if that's better for everyone.
That's great. Thank you.
Excellent. So presentation itinerary, I just wanted to kind of cover 4 topics real quick. I wanted to speak a little bit about my organization, the Minority Business Development Agency, and the Institute for Economic Development. I wanted to speak very briefly about economic development and the role of trade in economic development. I will then want to present my data on the US trade picture throughout the COVID lockdown, and then I'll provide a few conclusions, and I want to leave room for Q&A. Okay, so again, we are the Minority Business Development Agency Export Center. I'm just going to skip this slide real quick. I want to give a little bit of context on kind of the government's role in trade promotion and trade promotion assistance. So here I just have kind of a quick structural picture of the government, and I just kind of highlighted some of the organizations that I tend to work with among the broader community that helps US firms get access to international markets. Commerce, Department of State, Department of Treasury, US Trade Representative. I wanted to single out a little bit the Department of Commerce and just kind of highlight a few of the organizations that we work with very closely here. We have the International Trade Administration, which is probably one of the larger arms in US export assistance. Here at the bottom, we have the Minority Business Development Agency, which focuses on minority business development, and I serve a specialized role within that organization, helping minority-owned firms across the country get access to international markets. I just kind of briefly highlighted Census here. They help us a lot with data collection, some of which I'll be presenting to you. And moving along, I just wanted to very briefly talk about my organization, the Institute for Economic Development. We work in economic development. We have several partners and stakeholders that work with us in implementing several of our programs. Some of the larger ones are the Small Business Administration, the Minority Business Development Agency, which I'll refer to as MBDA moving forward, the state of Texas, USAID, Chase, the Organization of American States. We do some developmental work across the Western Hemisphere, Latin America, and the Caribbean, Department of State. So several organizations that we work with that assist us in support and funding in order to make our work possible. Very briefly here, I'm just going to outline the programs within our center. We have the MBDA Business Center, which I'm a sub-department of, that focuses on international trade. Most of these entities work at various sizes, kind of slicing out economic development work. We have many of them work just within the city and the surrounding counties. Many of them work within the state. There's a few that work within kind of a 5-state area, like the Trade Adjustment Assistance Center. And then, of course, we have 2 departments that work in international trade: the International Trade Center, which works under the SBA Small Business Development Center model, and they also do some development work in Latin America, and the MBDA Business Center. The SBDC Center, Small Business Development Center, really focuses on assisting small businesses in the Southwest Texas region, and we work with minority companies all across the country. We specialize in helping them access markets in Latin America, but we generally do work on helping them deal with trade issues globally. So I'm not going to spend too much more time on that. I just want to kind of briefly mention the mission of the MBDA. It's the U.S. Department of Commerce. MBDA is the only federal agency solely dedicated to the growth and global competitiveness of minority business enterprises. Just a quick showing of who we serve. We can work with any firm that has at least that is a U.S. firm, at least 51% U.S. interests, which identifies and can self-certify as one of the United States government recognized ethnic minorities, which are namely African American, Hispanic American, Asian and Pacific Islander American, Native American, Asian Indians, and Hasidic Jews. And what we do, what the MBDA does in general, is promotes the growth of minority-owned businesses through the mobilization and advancement of public and private sector programs, policy, and research. And we are one of these programs that helps specifically in the area of international trade. I just want to say a few words about economic development and the benefits of trade in general. So I'm not going to go through a lot of citations and keep this very academic, but by and large, the economic view on the benefits of trade is that it increases output and it lowers prices for consumers. trade has become controversial in the last few years politically, and I don't want to get into any of those debates, but in general, the economic views are the trade benefits are widely dispersed. In the last 20 years, we've probably seen a lot of commodities, a lot of technology, a lot of products. Think what a TV and the size of what those TVs were, just as one example, 20 years ago compared to how those costs have incrementally dropped over the last 20 years. You can say the same thing about computers, laptops, technology. There are a few quality issues based on how supply chains have been allocated, but by and large, economists see trade as providing benefits that are widely dispersed. And unfortunately, one of the issues that has been in the political spotlight were areas where there's job losses, because those tend to be locally concentrated. If there is a factory that closes in a town, it very deeply affects that town. Even if it might cause broader benefits on the aggregate. And these are areas where economic development can play a role in mitigating the transitions that are caused by trade liberalization and in general in market movements. As far as trade and benefits, there are some job creation aspects of international trade, and those are primarily associated with exports. Exports create jobs, and here is the results of a study that was performed and published by the International Trade Administration in 2016. The export leader is the state where I currently live and work, and I actually grew up here as well before I started all of my international travels, is Texas, which has been the leader in exports for, I want to say 17 or 18 years running. And there's almost 1 million jobs as of 2016 that were supported by Texas firms exporting. So that's not an insignificant number. And as you can see, here are some numbers of the jobs that are supported across the nation by exports. The other area which creates jobs where there's foreign transactions that take place is foreign direct investment. Here in San Antonio, there's a relatively known foreign direct investment project that is well established, which was the Toyota opening of the plant. I believe that they do all the Tundras, and I want to say Tacomas as well in the nation are produced there. And I've been to that plant. I've seen it. It operates 24/7, and my understanding is they've at least in the last several years they haven't been able to pump them out quickly enough. So this is actually my workstation. I wanted to speak a little bit before getting into the data about the impact of COVID-19 and what my perspective has been as a trade development professional and an economic development professional. I didn't want to do a whole lot of citation and keep this very academic, so I want to just kind of provide it as my cursory experience. And basically, this is my workstation. This is where I've spent most of my time.
That's your cat, Peter?
She may make a cameo if she runs across that's one of them. The other one doesn't disturb me as much. So, but yeah, this is my workstation. This is where I've spent a significant portion of my time since probably about mid-March. When we transitioned from work to working from home. Basically after I finish my day here, I clear the table, eat dinner, and run to the other side of the house and try to convince myself that I work from home, I don't live at work. But by and large, this is the experience that we've seen. Basically in January, the initial effects of COVID started to be seen in supply chains, especially with some of the larger US firms and US suppliers. They started to see that there were, things were getting pushed back, and they started to see the effects of an overall reliance in their supply chains on China as Chinese production went down. Typically, end of the year, beginning of the year tend to be high production time in China because China tends to slow down very much leading into Chinese New Year. And so there's usually a push before there is that lull. And so there's a lot of activity in international trade that happens in January, and that activity was not happening in China as they were dealing with the effects of COVID, which it started there essentially. By February, we started to anticipate that this may be something that affects the United States. Now, I've been traveling over the last couple of decades working in international business. And so I had lived through SARS and MERS and H1N1 and Ebola and several other scares where there were concerns of a potential pandemic. None of those reached the United States in any significant capacity prior to this one. So I was a little bit aware of what the protocol was, what the World Health Organization and the CDC, what their approaches were to dealing with something like this. So it was probably about early to mid-February that we began to prepare for potential, for COVID potentially coming here. Probably it was right around mid-March when we transitioned to working from home. We actually had some people that may have been on one of the last flights out of El Salvador doing development work there before we stopped doing all of the international travel and we moved from working from home. International trade, my area, quickly kind of went out of focus. Clearly, as an impending shutdown happened, or as it became clear that one was going to happen, the focus very much shifted to helping the American worker and helping the U.S. the U.S. economic situation. And much of that has, we all saw the CARE Act come through. Much of that focused on providing the liquidity that firms would need as the activity dropped, especially as the service, hospitality, retail, and other sectors which were disproportionately hit by this. As the activity dropped significantly, the approach was to introduce enough liquidity into the market to essentially bridge these firms into the recovery. And very much myself, I for probably March, April, and even part of May, I was not focusing on international trade almost at all. I was helping with the firms that I was working with, put together contingency plans, continuation of operation plans, and get access to capital through the CARE Act, through the Paycheck Protection Program, through the, I tend to know these as acronyms, so I sometimes try to forget. Tend to forget what they are spelled out. The EIDL is the other program that I'm thinking about, Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. And much of the approaches to dealing with COVID were disaster relief. They were built off of the models of disaster relief. One of the differences between COVID and a traditional disaster, which may be something like fires, earthquakes, storms, is there was no actual destruction of capital. So, one of the hopes as we transition out of this is that we will move in, there may be some capacity, there will be some training issues, but the hope is that the recovery may be a bit more rapid because we don't have to deal with rebuilding anything. It's just about kind of getting the gears started up again. So, after probably May, June, there was some focus that started to resume on international trade matters. Now, U.S. Customs and U.S. logistics had largely proceeded unaffected by this. They remained open. There were several countries, especially in less developed areas, where customs and logistics were spotty. There were kind of unreliable services, and there were delays. But in the US, customs and logistics primarily maintained operation throughout. Now, there were definitely some price shifts. I think at one point, air freight went up about 6 times what it was prior to COVID, as a lot of the personal protective equipment, PPE, was being shipped around. And maritime freight went down to about a quarter of what it was previously, as there was a lull in that activity. Now, some of that we have seen come back in probably the last month, as we've seen there was a normalization in air freight, but ground freight and sea freight prices have been going up, and many people working in supply chains have probably seen unexpected increases in costs. That's definitely one of the things that firms that I've been working with have been discussing. The area where there have been more challenges, the ports and the docks and the machines that load the containers, it's relatively easy to do the social distancing. The areas where I've seen more challenges in international trade have been the actual deal making of it. Obviously, trade shows have stopped. Travel of personnel to large gatherings have stopped. A lot of investments I see being held up as people wait and see. New deals are not necessarily, I don't see that activity, at least not in the mid-market as much. And small to mid-sized firms may also be more reticent to act in the current environment. So I'm hoping that some of the data that I'm going to present here in a minute will influence or at least stimulate a discussion on how these firms should be reacting moving forward. That's probably all that I'm going to say on my perspective, and I'll jump into the data.
And Peter, and that doesn't even really, I mean, that's big, what you just said in terms of setting the stage, but we also know that so many of us as business owners and as leaders of organizations, we also are looking at, what the COVID pandemic has also provided in terms of we have a loss of loved ones, employees. I think today, September 21st, we're looking at having over 200,000 American casualties. The global number is much more. It's almost, I think it's almost at 1 million. And so all of these instances that you're talking about also has to be overlaid with the fact that we're still experiencing death and still with no predictable end point, since we don't have an actual solution. And we're hoping that there's something that will be manufactured that would give us the ability to be able to be immunized and to be able to be safeguarded from the COVID-19. But I'll let you continue.
I agree, and I think that's an excellent point, because that really draws to the significance of what we're talking about. The significance is in human impact, human lives. I'm speaking more on the economic side and on the international trade side, and so I'm going to be getting into numbers and data, but ultimately what is important here is the human impact. And I have looked at this throughout as, I'm not an epidemiologist. My background is in economics, finance, international trade. And the epidemiologists, I go by their expertise. And I do believe that from an economic standpoint, we have to work within the epidemiological constraints and the epidemiological reality of the situation that we're dealing with. So I think that's an excellent point. I'm going to just step away for 2 seconds and grab a watch, as I don't have a time indicator. I just want to make sure that I'm going good on time. I will be right back. Excuse me.
All right, well, this is a commercial break for Global Chamber. Since we are in the midst of the COVID pandemic, though, again, just reiterating what I was stating about the 200,000 casualties in America and then across the globe, we thought that this information was going to be very good for you, because we know that there's been a shift in the marketplace overall. Doing business before has changed, and so we wanted to give you at least some of the current trends, and Peter is the person who's been giving our chamber the trends and the international trade, and so we wanted to give you this presentation. So Peter's back, and he has his watch in front of him. Go ahead, Peter.
Thank you, and it looks like we are good on time. So here I have a study that was presented by Goldman Sachs on composite economic activity. This is basically a measure that Goldman Sachs was using to measure the effect of COVID on the economy. In the general news and through various reports, it's varied somewhat industry by industry, but we've heard reports of many industries being down as much as 50 to 90% during the COVID lockdown. Obviously, some of the more affected industries, as I mentioned earlier, with things like hospitality, aviation, retail, and a lot of service sector, which employs many Americans. These are sectors that provide a lot of the employment within our country. But this is and of course some have benefited as well. Firms like Zoom, a lot of communication and information technology has benefited. Clearly, things like PPE, medical, personal protective equipment, various industries have benefited. Logistics and delivery companies. We're having much more delivered to our doors today rather than rather than going to brick and mortar stores. I was in a conference with Customs and Border Protection last week, and they were saying that they've seen the advances in logistics probably go about 3 to 5 years ahead of what they had expected at this time over the last 3 or 4 months. So here I have just basically a rubric that I want to measure my data against, provided by Goldman Sachs. And when this was published, they have data here through June. At the time, I was not able to get trade data through June. I was only able to get it through May. But information in mid to late June was coming out showing that there was a better than expected recovery within the US economy. And here we can see it, according to their measure, it went down to about 36% activity. So that's a decline of over 60%. And it went back to about a 60% of activity, so a decline of about 40%. So I want to kind of use this as a rubric to evaluate my own data against. So at the time that we put all of this together probably about 2 weeks ago, where we were planning on doing this presentation. If you had looked over that white paper that Chris made available and that Global Chamber made available to you guys, the data stopped around May, which was really the bottom of this curve. Since planning to put this together over the last 2 weeks, I was able to get the trade data for June and July. It was released almost together within the last 2 weeks. I probably got it about a week ago, and I was able to plug it into my models. So what we see here is essentially a time series of exports, total U.S. exports from about 2017 to 2020 through July of this year. And so we see here obviously what the previous 3 years were. 2017 was a down year. There was a lot of tumult in international trade markets. The Trump administration had come in, and I'm not going to get political, but the Trump administration had come in, and there was a fair amount of uncertainty in international trade, and we did see a decline in 2016, which I don't have data for, in 2017, but we did see it resume and normalize in 2018 and 19. And I had only used the last 3 years data because when there's a significant shift, I just wanted to look at trends that take into account kind of more the recent history. So as we can see here, the decline in trade, so on average over those 3 years, 2017 to 2019, US exports were around, I think they were just shy of 135 billion a month. So that's the average for those years, 17 through 19. As we can see here, there was a bit of a decline during the COVID period, but it's not as large of a decline as we saw across the broader U.S. economy. You can see this isn't 60%. And I'll get to the percentages here in a moment. This is essentially the same data, but instead of going 0 to 160 billion, I go 80 to 160. And this is just to kind of visually represent a little bit more the variance that we've seen in overall trade data. I have the same data for imports. The average imports over those 3 years, 17 through 19, was around 210 billion. There is a trade deficit. And we've seen also that there was a dip in imports during this time, but it was less significant than the dip in exports. And as we can see in July, just in absolute numbers, imports were higher than they were at this time in 2017. And here again is the same data, just stretched out a little bit to show the variance. Now, what I wanted to do here is I wanted to adjust this data for seasonality. So what I did here, this 0 line essentially is the average. So I mentioned this is export data, that the average exports over those 3 years in the US were about just shy of 135 billion a month. What I did here is I factored in what was the seasonality over those 3 years. So for example, in January, average exports were down 8% off of that average for the 3 years prior. March was the high, was kind of the boom month in exports for the US. It was about 7.2% over that 135 billion average. And then what I did here is I essentially plugged in the actual numbers as they were reported by UN Comtrade. The same data is available. Imports are available from the US Census as well, and exports from the Department of Commerce International Trade Administration. But I was able to just access all of this data through UN Comtrade. And what we have here is we see the yellow line essentially shows what happened to US exports from the average, from that 135 billion, and the green line shows that seasonally adjusted. So obviously in cases where the trend is, like as we see here in January, 8% below, the green line is going to be above the yellow line. In areas where trade is disproportionately, where the trend is to go over the average.
Okay, so we lost our presenter. He'll sign back in, I'm sure. And we do have some questions that have come in that we'll provide Peter with. In the meantime, I also want to share with you our event that's coming up. It's the International State of the Metro, and this is going to enable our mayor of San Antonio, Ron Nirenberg, to talk about how San Antonio is performing in international trade. As Peter showed you very clearly, that Texas has been leading the nation with export. And so Mayor Nirenberg will talk about, the growth of San Antonio as the 7th largest U.S. city, dealing with some of the challenges that we have had with the areas of trade. Also giving opportunities for international companies who would like to come to the San Antonio marketplace. We believe that we have the right type of situation here for companies to be able to capitalize on our interesting and vast type of an economy that's here. If you've never come to Texas, you have to come to Texas, because everything is bigger in Texas. We try to do things big. And we'll be honoring actually Peter Grabiec, who is our board member, and we'll—
Let me know when you can hear me, Chris. Sorry.
I do hear you right now, Peter. So I'm going to give you back the screen. So I was just updating them to our International State of the Metro that will be next Friday on October the 2nd. And so I'm going to stop my share.
I apologize. My computer went down and I got on through my phone. That's why you don't see me. Do you have a copy of my presentation that you can put up? I apologize. And I believe that we were on the trend data for exports slide. We don't have a whole lot left to go, and I apologize to everyone for the technical difficulties.
Let's see.
And I was just getting through the more technical and less exciting part of the data, and I guess my computer fell asleep. So I'll kind of go very quickly through the import side, which is essentially the same data, and get into my conclusions and open up the floor to conversation, because I would very much like to turn this into a dialogue.
Okay.
And while Chris gets this up, the visual cues, I'll just continue. Essentially, what we see, especially when you look at it seasonally adjusted, is international trade has essentially already had a V-shaped recovery. We see when you seasonally adjust it, in July, exports were only down about 10% from the previous 3-year average, and imports were down, I want to say, somewhere between 2 to 3% from the 3-year average. Obviously, we don't know what last month's data is yet. That data hasn't been crunched, and it hasn't gone through the reporting channels. But I was a little surprised. Obviously, one of the big debates in economic development and in this recovery is, what will it look like? Will it be a V shape? Will we kind of shoot back to where we were moving forward? Or will it be more of an L shape? Will it be more of a gradual economy? Many economists that I have heard speak on this matter are leaning more towards an L-shaped recovery. And of course, we don't know what the epidemiological reality of this will be either. Many epidemiologists are predicting a tough fall. And there's also just general concerns that many Americans have simply gotten comfortable and complacent with the situation, and there are concerns that there may be a spike, kind of long story short. So I think we're a few slides down from there, Chris.
Okay, is it whether the seasonality slide or the compare?
We can go just above that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's where we were when we crashed. So
Yes.
So again, the green line, I believe, is the one that is most representative of the reality of the situation as it's seasonally adjusted. And then you can just probably go 2 slides down and we can look at the same picture for imports. And again, this is the one where it's even closer to par than exports were. So we can continue. Next slide. And here I just brought the Goldman Sachs study back for comparison. Next slide, please. Okay, so my conclusions from this data are that US international trade activity is far more resilient to the pandemic shock than other sectors and than what we had initially believed. One of the conversations that has come out of all of this is, that we need to make trade more resilient. Now, much of this comes out of the dependency many supply chains had on China, which as early as January started to make itself apparent. And so there have been conversations, and it seems that much of the trend since probably the 1970s in international trade has been moving towards efficiency. We've gotten to the point in our global supply chain where many companies don't even have inventories anymore. Firms across the country, across the world have moved to just-in-time inventory, expecting the goods to just come in from literally halfway around the world according to a predictable schedule that they can then manage. The pandemic has strained that view somewhat, but in the end, looking at the data that I've just presented you, it has shown to be somewhat more resilient than initially assumed. Now, another conclusion, US trade has already experienced a V-shaped recovery. That's the case that I make. And for US firms, the argument here is that engaging in international markets is a path for growth, diversification, and resilience. Now, not every firm is capable of engaging in international markets. Clearly, dry cleaning, food service, hospitality, these are not things that it's possible to internationalize. Of course, there may be some firm out there that I want to leave it open for some firm to innovate and to make that possible. But the international trade tends to happen at a different level of the supply chain. You have to get to a certain size, a certain scale, and to have the capacity to engage in international markets and to benefit from the efficiencies that it brings. I've worked with U.S. firms for going on 20 years now, working on international trade and economic development. And the biggest challenge that I've found, frankly, is that a lot of firms, U.S. firms, simply do not engage. I'm of the firm belief that if at a more decentralized level we were more active in engaging international markets, we would find that we're more successful in them, and we would even find them in many cases to be more lucrative than less risky, less uncertain, and more lucrative than what we may have initially assumed. The U.S. is a very, very well developed, and of course, why don't U.S. companies look abroad? Well, the same reason other companies try to come here. We are the largest economy. We're around 25% of the global economy. It's a large market. It's large, and the mentality from many U.S. firms is it's large enough for me to do my business here. But it's also an extremely competitive market, and I have found that in many cases there may be much more room for development if you engage outside, if you engage your business outside of the United States. And then, of course, there's the factor that it's 95% of the world's population is out there, and we are living through an era. The Cold War ended more than 20, almost 30 years ago now, and everybody's kind of playing the same game, and we have seen development, especially in the countries that are catching up the most. Obviously, China has been kind of a glaring outlier, but we have seen development across Africa. We've seen development across Latin America until about 2014, where there was a commodities bust, and they ran into, especially some of the larger economies there. I was actually in Brazil at the time, ran into some trouble and traction, the larger ones being places like Brazil, Argentina. But nonetheless, we do seem to be living in an era where trade and development is, the world is becoming that much more integrated. So one of my conclusions here is that there is much for U.S. firms to benefit in engaging the global market, despite its challenges, in a decentralized manner. Next slide, please. So one of the big questions, obviously, is to what extent does this data, what does it tell us about the rest of the U.S. economy and the possibility, the ideal, I think everybody would want a V-shaped recovery because that's what would be best for the country. So what does it tell us? As I mentioned, international trade is it's kind of a different layer of the global economy because it tends to work more in supply chains. In an economics class, one example that almost every intro economics professor around the country might one illustration that they might provide for their classes, they might show, look at a pencil. They might say, okay, so where do you think this pencil was made? And the students will say, I'm not going to go through the steps, but essentially it might end up being something like the rubber was from India or Brazil, the metal may have come from a mine in Chile, the wood may have come from Canada, the graphite inside may have come from another country, and somehow all of this got put together from around the world and into a pencil that costs, how much is a pencil nowadays? 10 cents? I don't know, but that goes to that argument of lowering international trade, lowering the prices of what we buy. So what I want to do in these next few slides is I just want to address some of the mitigating factors that might limit the extent to which we can infer from this data that the U.S. economy will have a V-shaped recovery as well. And the big one is the substitution effect. Typically when one thing goes up in price or is more difficult to get, people will substitute. In global markets, we see this in grains and corn. As one goes up, the other might substitute for it. When prices get very high, you'll see instability. I know that when the Arab Spring happened, that happened to be a time where a lot of U.S. grains were being invested and redirected into ethanol production, and we were exploring that, and we saw a percentage spike in grain prices around the world. For U.S. consumers, spiking grain prices is something that you almost don't notice, but in parts of the world, such as the Middle East, where grains and carbohydrates make up a larger part of the diet, it has an effect. And some economists might point, myself included, to the fact that that may have been one of the underlying conditions for something like the Arab Spring and the unrest that we saw in that area. Proteins, if the price of fish goes up, you might eat more chicken or might eat chickpeas or something like that. So there may be some mitigating factors in the substitution effect, and I do have data. I'm just going to gloss over it very quickly. On this next slide, and I'd be happy to make this available. Here we have an international trade. Now this is a little bit technical. This is organized according to the harmonized tariff schedule. It organizes all products that are all goods that are traded, that leave customs, into 99 chapters. And so these are the chapters that have seen the most growth. This data is only February, March, I believe February, March, April, might have May there as well. And if you go to the next slide, it's basically the substitution effect for the losers, the firms that have suffered the most here. And I know two here that you can pretty easily find. One of them is aviation, which the US does a lot of trade in aviation. Another one was oil and petrochemicals, another area. Those were down significantly, and I don't know if you want to try and find those numbers there on the right-hand column real quick. But I don't want to bore you with numbers anymore, so we can go out of this. But again, the substitution effect, we've seen this in the general economy as well, where things like Zoom and home deliveries of products have had a boom, whereas retail, service, places, concerts, events that require large gatherings have had to be curtailed for the epidemiological reasons. So again, there it's just pandemics cause shifts across industries. Next slide, please. Okay, this might be there were two other areas. I'm pretty much finished, but there were two other possible mitigating factors. One of them that I'll just mention real quickly. One of them is there may be some inflationary pressures making their way across global markets. Now, I think that it's less likely that this has a significant effect because we're looking at all U.S. trade, everything that's coming and going. So there may be some effects going on, but I just thought that I would mention it. And there's one other area is one of the things that we've seen, and in any down market, we tend to see a lot of mergers and acquisition. Any recession, a lot of, especially for larger firms, planning tends to be planning for the business cycle, which is, the booms and the busts. And one of the things that we see during the busts, obviously in my professional career, there have been two big ones. One, the 2007, 2008 financial crisis. The second one being this COVID lockdown and the impact that we're dealing with. You do see a lot of mergers and acquisitions. You do see a lot of, where the capital is centralized. I think Walter Bagehot, who, was a British thinker and influenced central banking a lot, he basically said, in a crisis, lend freely against good collateral. And, we see that. We see acquisitions. And so as to who's been benefiting for this V-shaped recovery, as I mentioned, I've seen a few small mid-sized firms that are very active, especially in the areas that have obviously peaked in this, technology, PPE. But a lot of firms I see kind of wait on the wait and see sidelines. And so again, I hope that this data shows, especially if you have any kind of tangential access to international markets, that this may be an area where there's growth and opportunity. So with that, yes.
Yeah, so with that, we're gonna actually have some questions that I want to jump into while we have the remaining 12 minutes. Are you ready?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so one question is, where do you see some of the remaining hot products and services areas in 2020 and anything new in 2021?
So I think that by and large, we've seen where we've already seen where the waves had shifted. And so firms that are able to take advantage of this, things like home entertainment, I think, obviously Netflix has had a challenge probably producing new content because of the need to get people together, the epidemiological constraints. But I know that video games sales have been up, various types of home entertainment, logistics is going to be an area, things that anything that can adapt to the epidemiological reality, so long as that is something that we need to deal with. I'm also always optimistic on the opportunity that areas where there is suppressed demand, if there can be creative ways of tapping that, within the epidemiological constraints, or when the epidemiological constraints start to loosen, there may be a surge of demand in those areas. And as to what the particular ones are, we shall see. So by and large, I think those are the two areas of growth: is either ride the wave of the demand shifts that we've already seen, also be prepared for that wave to subside, if the landscape shifts, and look for areas where there may be pent-up demand, see if you can meet it, and look for the opportunities when the roads to meet it might become more clear.
Peter, Doug Brunke, the founder of Global Chamber, asked a real good question, and that is, the U.S. trade deficit is at or near an all-time high or low, worse since 2008. How do you see that tracking in the next year?
So one of the things that so we've run a deficit for much of the recent era of international trade, and there's various interpretations as to why that is. In general, what most economists simply chalk it up to is, when the U.S. economy is strong, Americans import more. When the U.S. economy is strong, Americans import more. So trade deficit is not necessary. And you can look at a time series graph. When the U.S. economy is strong, this is true. And when it gets weaker, they import less. And so I think that's one of the trends. Now, and this gets a little bit more into kind of technical economics. There's the balance of trade and the balance of payments. One of them deals with investment and longer term investments. The other one deals with just imports and exports. When you have a deficit, you can maintain that as long as it's offset by foreign direct investment. And historically, a lot of and conversely, when you have a surplus, you have to invest that somewhere. One of the relationships that I point to where this has been most evident has been with the US and Japan. We've had considerable amounts of foreign direct investment from Japan. I mentioned the Toyota plant previously. So this is kind of one of the mechanisms where you can find an equilibrium, even running a deficit, so long as it doesn't become so large that it has kind of secondary effects. And I don't think that we've seen any of those manifest, other than the problem that I mentioned earlier, where you have very broadly diffused benefits and very localized losses. And that's an area where I think governments, communities can address those shifts.
Okay. So we have a question from Jesse Gonzalez, and he wrote, where would you see possible inflation pressure, as just mentioned? Any idea on where or if interest rates will increase anytime soon or possibly go negative?
Very tough question. I think that's a very tough thing to speculate about, especially given the current climate. One of the things that we've seen in recent years was a lot of cash infusion into the economy, an economy that doesn't have a lot of economic activity, but a lot of money is going in there. One of the results that we've seen of that it has strengthened and preserved the financial system. We've seen a lot of Americans paying down debt. There may be some criticisms as to, this is helping Wall Street, not necessarily Main Street. Those are well placed, and those are certainly areas that need to be addressed moving forward. I know that the Harvard economist Ken Rogoff, I heard him say, essentially in dealing with COVID, this was as COVID was ramping up, and I agree with this. This is like a wartime finance scenario, and basically the goal is, do the Walter Badgett thing, spend freely against good collateral. Do what you can to get us to the other side, and then whatever the problems of the other side are, we'll deal with those when they arise. And I think that one of those potential problems may be inflation. So, because again, so much money, and this is under the general view that inflation is too much money chasing too few goods and services. So obviously the price of those goods and services is going to go up to meet the money supply. So I do think that this is one of tomorrow's concerns for certain. I don't think that we're there yet on really having to address it. I think we still need to get to that other side. And the primary factors on dealing with that are, taking care of Main Street, taking care of Americans and their needs as, they're locked down at home. And this may be less of an economic concern than it is psychological, than it is a community concern. Because as I mentioned, financial markets look strong. It looks like nothing has been destroyed. We just kind of all went home. So it's just a matter of getting to the other side and gearing up the economy. And that's a simplistic view, but I think that encompasses a swath of what we're talking about. So okay. I don't know if that directly answers your question, but those are my thoughts on your question.
So you touched on a little bit earlier. So where are air, rail, and marine shipping costs today? And where do you see those for the rest of the year? And you did touch on it in your presentation. So do you have specific details?
So I don't have very specific data. I've viewed this kind of in snippets in different industries. So I don't have specific data, and I do have I would want to have that data before I give you a concrete answer. In general, what I'm seeing, however, is that they are higher than what was anticipated, because many firms are largely having to deal with upcharges in freight and across maritime. I think air went down quite a bit compared to what it was like right when this crisis hit, as everyone was trying to ship PPE and get it, deal with the most immediate emergency. I don't know what the exact numbers are. I do think that that's important. As far as moving forward, as demand starts to come back, these things, prices of this will go up, which is what we've seen recently, which again, I think is a positive sign for overall recovery. And then at some point there will be an equilibrium. I'd really want to look at the data to give you any more definite of an answer than that, and I don't have that in front of me.
So we're going to go with our last question. Actually, this is from my brother, Joseph Herring. He read your white paper that I also provided the link for all those who are attending. And so he read your paper and he says, so how does your presentation today help minority-owned firms expand their presence in the international market? He saw that your paper alluded to that there was great opportunity for minority firms unlike any other time in our history.
Yeah, and I don't know if I said unlike any other, well, and may be true, unlike any other time in our history. I think that the world, we are, if you look at the...
Those were my comments, Peter.
Yeah, if you look at the larger picture, we have seen massive, tremendous global economic development over the last 20, 30 years. And a lot of that was spearheaded by initiatives, efforts, and the impetus of U.S. influence, but both in U.S. business practices. Now, I think that these things, and one of the things I also said earlier is that U.S. firms don't engage in international markets nearly as much as they should, as much as they can, as much as to the extent of the potential that I see out there, having spent a good chunk of the last 20 years just kind of living out in different parts of the world. I've been fortunate enough to just have had that sort of experience. So yeah, I do think that it's, and I think that this goes to cultural issues. When I'm dealing with US firms, I kind of throw out this data and these arguments and trends, and then when we go out to start to engage other countries, then I say, okay, now slow down. Now relax, now get to know these people, learn about their culture, start to build relationships. And so I think that a lot of it is just bridging that cultural aspect. The United States has shown itself since its founding to be a great place for people from other parts of the world to come, shed the baggage of their histories, many of which go back hundreds, if not thousands of years, and find success, you know, find the American dream. I mean, my family is an example of this. My family immigrated. My family were Cold War refugees. They came, you know, coming from Eastern Europe, and they came here. They worked as entrepreneurs, started their own businesses, came with literally no command of the language and 25 bucks in their pocket, and built businesses and basically climbed their way to the upper middle class. And I think for minorities, that is the path, is entrepreneurship. One of my colleagues once mentioned to me, and I haven't verified this data, but I'll take it on their word, that the average African American entrepreneur has about 60 times the wealth of the average African American that is not an entrepreneur. That's staggering. So I definitely think that, one, I would look broadly at entrepreneurship as a path to wealth creation development. And not everyone has to be Bill Gates. It's, you know, I'm sure a lot of people would be happy with a 6-figure salary and putting their kids through college. And I think that's very much within reach on the entrepreneurship path.
Okay. Well, thank you, Peter. Oftentimes we hear that and this is just my commentary, oftentimes we hear that it's so expensive for a business to get into the international market. And sometimes it's not as expensive as what we may think. There are significant relationships that can be developed, partnerships, strategic alliances. Through Global Chamber, for instance, I've been able to increase my business just because I have new partners across the world who I'm able to do business with. And there's a trust and teamwork. I do want to say, as we close, thank you for all those who were able to attend today's Globinar. The surprising resilience of the U.S. trade during the COVID-19 lockdown. Peter did demonstrate that our U.S. trade has been resilient. Also want to say, if you don't have your Global Chamber membership, go to globalchamber.org and sign up, and you can get a pin. I have pins here in San Antonio for our members, but I want you to get yourself involved. Of 525 metropolitan markets across the world, we're one chamber, and we're able to touch all subject matters that have to do with international business and trade. So get your memberships, get them today. Find the metropolitan market that you best align with, because I know we have people from all over the world, and sign up today. The memberships are very comparable to what you would experience in your local marketplaces. Thank you again, Peter, and I'm sorry that you went out on us, but you did recover. And again, the white paper has been made available, so please touch it right now, download it. And thank you, Global Chamber, for hosting today's Globinar. Y'all have a great day.
Thank you. Yeah.